Well, this is Baruch Fleischman, and we are here and getting into Yaakov Kronenberg's great book, Jewish Astrology, Cosmic Science, and you'll be hearing more about the science part as we go through. So let's start off with chapter 10 and go where we can. It says, in Nebuchadnezzar's first dream, the Chaldeans responded before the king and said, there is no man on earth who could relate the king's matter. That is why no king, leader, or ruler has ever requested such a thing of any necromancer, or astrologer, or Chaldean. Which means they were requested to not only interpret the dream, but to first figure out what the dream was because the king forgot. Of the four, Nebuchadnezzar only mentions three, and leaves out the Mechashvim, which are the magicians, because it is not their way to make known things like this. Rather, their job is to explain the different forces that are on the earth and when they increase or decrease. In a similar vein, Daniel didn't mention them when he said to Nebuchadnezzar the secret that the king requests there is no wise man, astrologer, or necromancer, nor demonists are able to tell the king. He didn't mention the magician, because it is not their way to reveal secrets of the future. But he did mention the Gezran, who ponder the movement of the planets through the constellations, because it is their way to speak about the future, which is hidden from the rest of mankind. He didn't mention the Kusdim to Nebuchadnezzar. Rather, he mentioned the Hartumim and Ashuv, because the Kusdim were not mentioned before the king at that time. Similarly, Daniel didn't mention them among the wise men either. Ashvar, Hatumen, Gezran, because they were students of the Ashben and were drawn after them, and they sullied themselves in idol worship more than the Ashben. Because of this, he saw no reason to mention them. In another place, the Hartumen were left out. Like it says, just then the fingers of a human hand came forth and wrote in the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, facing the candelabrum, and the king saw the palm of the hand that was writing. The king's appearance therefore changed, and his thoughts bewildered him. The belt on his waist opened, and his knees knocked on one against the other. This king cried out loud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the demonists. The king explained to the sages of Babylonia that only a person who would read this writing and tell him its interpretation would wear royal purple with a chain of gold on his neck and would rule 1/3 of the kingdom. He didn't mention among them the Hartumim, because it is not proper to ask them about something which requires deep wisdom and understanding, like the writing that was written on the plasters of the wall of the king's palace. So Rabbi Avraham goes through all different places in the book of Daniel where all these people are mentioned, sometimes in 4 names, sometimes in 3 names, and sometimes their names are changed. I think you should read for yourself at all of these different passages, where all these names are located, and get a better idea that you will get from just listening to me. But I think we see that the main idea is that all these different kinds, these areas, are different kinds of idol worship, which are forbidden. So he says, we find one place, let me see, I'm losing space here. Let me see if I can get some more space. How about moving this way? So, we're right here. We find one place in the book of Exodus where all 3 of these types as mentioned above in Daniel were left out, where they were not needed, and only the Mechashvim by themselves were mentioned. Like it says in the book of Exodus, and Pharaoh called out to the wise men and the magicians. He called to the wise men who were magicians at the time when he saw the staff of Moses turn into a snake. Right away he called the magicians who know the times when the powers of different forces in the world are strengthened, to see when the power of the form of the snake, or the power of the wood, or the power of the staff would be strengthened by the movements of the stars to do this. They took advice together and agreed that the snake has only the powers to bite and doesn't have any other power at this time. the wisdom of the magicians is dependent on the movement of the stars and has no power over it. However, the Hartomim, whose work is hidden with them from times past, they hurried to do, and because the magicians didn't protest it, as they were considered partners, like it says, and the Hartomim of Egypt, they also did with their staffs. It could have said the Hartomim of Egypt did. However, since it said they also did, we see that the magicians were considered one of them, because they didn't protest. So all these people, the magicians and the Hartomim, also made staffs and turned them into stakes. We also see here that every plague God brought to the Egyptians in Egypt, none of them were able to be caused by the movements of the planets. In other words, in order to make known to the nations of the world their lack of wisdom before God's might. And similarly, you can say that all the decrees that God decreed on the evil planets of the world, the nations of the world, He doesn't decree them except at a time when the planets do not testify to the decree. And if the prophecy should be learned from the planetary movements, then what is the prophet coming to reveal to us? This is an important point which Rabbi Avraham makes, that all the miracles that happened to the people of Israel had no indication to it in the sky. And all the decrees that God decreed on the evil nations of the world happened only when they did not expect it. Because if they were expecting it, they wouldn't see his might and would say it was because of the stars. So he intentionally does it just at the time when they say everything is going to be all right and everything looks good. Then the attack comes, and then they get it. And that only comes from the words of the prophets, because the prophets could see higher than the astrologers. He says, like we have said before, we said this previously, when you read the books of the prophets from 2,500 years ago, and look at the predictions, starting with Moses, you see how they predict things so clearly. What happens even in our times with such obviousness, and astrologers can only see things in general, and only in the near future. No astrologer is able to tell what would happen thousands of years from now. So God acted towards the nations intentionally when they were not expecting that, when astrologers didn't see any negative signs in heaven, so that they would know the greatness of God. Well, let me see what we have to do here. So we have a little bit more. I don't know. I want to go too long, but here we have to see this. We also see here that every plague brought on the Egyptians in Egypt, none of these were able to be caused by the movements of the planets. In order to make known to the nations of the world their lack of wisdom before God's might. And similarly, you can say that all the decrees that God decreed on the evil nations of the world, he doesn't decree them, except to a time when the planets do not testify to the decree. And if the prophecy could be learned from the planetary movements, then what is the prophet coming to tell us? However, it is right that the prophecy will not be in accordance with the movement of the constellations and planets. It's an important idea. So that all the wise men of the nations will consult and be confused and shocked in the face of God's might at the time they see their testimony and thoughts go against them. And similarly, the prophet Isaiah said, "Where are they? Where are your wise men? Let them tell you now. Let them try to know what God, master of the legions, has prepared for Egypt, to tell you that the decree which he advised to bring on Egypt, the experts in the wisdom of astrology, they saw it, but their wisdom was nullified before God's decree." Like it says, Pharaoh's wisest advisors offer boorish counsel. And the text is not coming to teach that the wise men of Egypt were liars, but rather to teach you God's strength, that he nullified the power of the planets and took away their power until the wise men will appear fools in their eyes. Like it says, "I am God, who abrogates the omens of the stargazers and makes fools of the astrologers, who makes wise men retreat and makes their knowledge foolish. No one except for the astrologers can see the awesome strength of God at these times when they see the decrees of the planets nullified before the righteous and good." and it increases fear and belief. So only astrologers can actually see how God is great. When they see things happening which according to the stars shouldn't have happened, so they see a kind of power of a lower prophetic vision, something which is beyond nature. So let us keep going. Now, he says, and he's going to continue, but we're not. This is Baruch Fleischman. This has been Yaakov Kronenberg, Reb Yaakov Kronenberg, Jewish astrologer.